The minute hands on the clock slowly moved on as I sat there in class, bored out of my mind, waiting for the dismissal bell. Waiting to be able to talk with my girlfriend briefly before we get on our buses and go home. The bell finally rang, and I jolted out of the classroom like 90 to nothing, down the hall and to the exit. That was my way of having a maximum amount of time with her. Jane, as usual, was already waiting by the entrance when I got out of the school. I hugged her and briefly kissed her before she asked me how my day was going so far. I told her, well, thank God it's Friday, so I won't have to deal with that asshole. Price for a couple of days. Seeing you, on the other hand, is definitely the best part of my day. She laughs, pointing out that I always say being with her is the best part of my day. I, too, laugh, insisting that it's true, and then ask her how her day was. We began to walk as she told me all about the events that had happened, about how one of her teachers wasn't in and she had a substitute. She then went to talk about how Lizzie was being a bitch, as usual. I was so focused on listening to her talk that I didn't even realize I had gotten her on the bus until after it had started moving and she pointed it out. I was about to ask the bus driver to stop when Jane suddenly had a better idea. She said I could spend the weekend with her and that we'll call my parents to tell them once we get to her house. I agreed since her parents were never home, plus my parents were chill and would be okay with it. So we continued talking and eventually we reached her stop. We both thanked the bus driver and quickly got off the large yellow death trap. I took Jane's hand in mine as we talked about what we would do during our weekend together, walking to her house. We ended up planning to go hang out in the woods near to her house the next day. We got to Jane's house about 10 minutes after we left the bus stop. When we got inside, I called my dad and told him what had happened. Just like I thought, he didn't mind, and said to be back by Monday. I agreed, and we hung up. After the call, I asked Jane what we were going to do now. She laughed, saying that she was going to go do her homework, and that I should too. I laughed and said that I'd do it Monday before school like I normally did, and I wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. She rolled her eyes and pointed out that I wouldn't have anything to do with her until she was done, saying I might as well just get it over with. I didn't really have a counter-argument, so I sat down on the couch in the living room and did my homework too. About half an hour later, I'd finished my work, and waited for her to finish. When she did, we ended up goofing around for a bit, and decided to watch movies in her room. So I went and made popcorn for us, while she picked the movies and got them ready. I also had the thought to order dinner, so that neither of us had to cook. When I got back and got settled in with her in bed, we cuddled up with each other and watched movies that she had picked, briefly stopping to eat dinner. After that, we continued watching movies until we went to bed. The next morning, after we woke up and had breakfast, we headed out to the woods. We both knew the parts we explored fairly well, but neither of us had explored too deep. After a while, we decided to head back, so we started walking when Jane suddenly got a mischievous grin on her face and said, "Race you back!" and started running in what she thought was in the right direction. I chased after her, but fell behind and lost sight of her. So I stopped running and decided to walk back. Eventually, however, I came to a realization. I was lost. I stopped and thought for a minute, and then decided to keep trying to find my way back. After a while of wandering, though, I found someone. It was Jane. She was a bit ahead, walking. I ran up to her and asked if she got lost too. She said that she had, but she knew where to go now, so we walked together. As we walked, I noticed something strange. Jane wasn't really talking. I started to feel kind of worried and asked her if she was alright, and she said that she was, so I didn't push it. After a while, though, she suddenly stopped and said that we were almost there. I was confused because we weren't even out of the woods yet, but I kept my mouth shut and kept going, despite the bad feeling I was getting. After a while, we ended up in a clearing that I recognized near the entrance to the woods, and I saw what looked like a person laying on the ground a little further up ahead. I started jogging there to get a closer look, but froze when Jane suddenly shouted not to go there. I was confused and said that we had to help them if they were hurt. Jane repeated that I can't go, but I ignored her and kept going. When I got there, I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at first, but then I realized what it was. There, laying on the ground before my eyes, was my girlfriend's mangled corpse. Her clothes were torn from her body. Her beautiful green eyes were gone. Her body was twisted in unnatural, broken ways. Her hair ripped out and placed on her chest. And her flesh... God. Her flesh was chewed and ripped off, down to the bone in some places. I vomited, and then turned to look at what I thought was Jane, who was grinning, teeth elongated into fangs, nails having become claws longer than her entire hand, eyes now huge, dark, empty voids, skin so thin and translucent that you could see every bone in her body. "I told you not to go, love," the creature said, in a voice that sounded like Jane's, but distorted and raspy. "I didn't want you to see this. I just wanted you to be happy," it screamed. I turned around and booked it, knowing how to get out of the woods from here. As I ran, I heard the creature say in Jane's voice, "See you soon, babe." When I got to the woods, I looked back to see if the creature was following me. I couldn't see it, but I still ran home. When I got back to my house, my parents asked me why I wasn't with Jane. I lied and said that we had gotten in a fight and that she broke up with me, not stopping until I got to my room, shutting the door. After that, I just sat in my room and cried for about 5 hours. I couldn't stop thinking about Jane and what had happened. I had finally stopped late that night, when things got even worse. That night, I heard what sounded like a tapping at my window. I ignored it, thinking that it was just the wind rattling the panes. After a couple of minutes, though, I couldn't ignore it, and looked. What I saw made me start crying again. It was the creature pretending to be Jane. It must have known I saw it, because it started begging me to let it in, using Jane's voice. I continued crying and doing my best to ignore it as it taunted me, using her voice. It finally left around 4 a.m. I'd hoped it wouldn't be back, but I wouldn't have such luck. It's been 3 months, and every night it comes, pretending to be Jane, begging me to let it in, saying that it loves me, and that it can't stand to be apart from me. I don't know how much more I can take.